Welcome to Brain Ponderings. There'll be two more episodes that I'll put up this year. And then in January, I have a really good lineup of neuroscientists that cover a range of interesting topics in the field. Today, though, I'm going to make a presentation, one probably the first in several, on problems with the American healthcare system, and particularly focusing on for-profit industries that drive, on the one hand, the development of chronic diseases by increasing obesity, for example, and on the other hand, tend to wait until the healthcare system waits till people get sick and then treats their symptoms with drugs or surgery. And this is a big problem. We spend more in the United States on healthcare per capita than any other developed country, and yet we have worse health outcomes uh, in a range of diseases and in shorter lifespans than in most developed countries that their healthcare systems are not for profit. They're universal healthcare, government-run healthcare systems. Okay, so this this is a diagram that's actually I took from an article that I wrote, published in 2012, that focused on energy metabolism, particularly obesity, its adverse effects on the brain on the one hand, and how exercise and energy restriction slash intermittent fasting can counteract that. And so this diagram shows different aspects of our system, our society, and our healthcare system. Within the middle are what can be considered some of the major capitalistic drivers of poor health, including brain health and disease. Monoculture agriculture, uh, with grains used to produce ultra-processed foods, high fructose corn syrup, for example, uh, fried foods using a lot of saturated oils. So I'll talk about that today. And then in subsequent presentations, I'll talk about the problems with the pharmaceutical industry, profit-driven problems with hospitals and physicians in terms of the way they operate and it's organized. Again, all comes back to the for-profit aspect. And then health insurance. All right. So at the end of the talk today, I'll kind of cover potential ways to counteract these what I call dark forces of the healthcare system. And so these green lightning bolts here are the different components of the system that could counteract what's driving poor health. So medical school need to emphasize uh, preventative medicine. There's virtually nothing taught in medical school on that. Johns Hopkins has tried to incorporate a little. For example, they have some special lectures. I gave one, for example, on intermittent fasting, but they do have some exposure of the students to that. But unfortunately, primary care physicians get paid a lot less than specialists who focus, whatever, a neurologist, um, or a surgeon or gastroenterologist, et cetera. And so a lot of the students, when they get out of medical school, they have a lot of debt because they have to take out loans to pay for medical school, and then they go into the higher paying sub-disciplines of medicine. And so there's really a shortage of primary care physicians that could be in the prime spot to help people improve their health. Then, of course, we have the interaction between the capitalistic drivers and the media, namely advertisements, whether it's for ultra-processed foods or drugs. And all people are affected, not only adults, but children, the education system. The health is covered some, but there's not a big effort to change the organization. For example, a simple thing like physical exercise is, at least when you get to high school in a lot of places, not required. The government, of course, a lot of the politicians are lobbied by these very wealthy industries, and they finance their campaigns, usually indirectly. And so they have a vested interest in not making drastic uh, uh, constraints on these industries. Um, Biomedical research, there could be more emphasis on prevention and uh, risk reduction. Most of the money, for example, from NIH funding goes to funding research into diseases with the idea of developing treatments. And in the case of the brain and neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, or even stroke, that's failed. There's no really treatments that affect the progression of the disease, and the emphasis has to be put on reducing the risk factors. And one of the major risk factors is poor diet and lifestyle, lack of exercise, overeating. And by the way, I'm showing slides on my YouTube channel, so if you're listening on Spotify or other outlets and you want to see what I'm showing, you can go over to my YouTube channel. Okay, so beginning in the 1980s, there was a dramatic increase in obesity rate in the United States with a tripling of number of people with body mass index over 30. And this doesn't include overweight people. If you throw in people with BMI over 25, then well over, it's about 60 to 70% of the population is overweight and not ideally fit. And if we look at this among the different United States in the US, we see that the states in the Southeast, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, West Virginia, as well as Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, they have the highest prevalence of overweight and obesity compared to other states. And there's a number of reasons for that. There is some role for socioeconomic status. These ultra-processed foods have a high calorie density, and so on a per calorie basis, they're relatively inexpensive. They're addictive, and there's also a cultural factor in terms of diet, and they may also have less education, less emphasis on this in the families in those states overall. Of course, that's overall. There's certainly a lot of individuals in these states who are health conscious and healthy. Okay, and that's not only true for adults, but it's true for adolescents. So there's been a big increase in children and adolescents with obesity as well. And this is associated with reduced life expectancy. Life expectancy is lower in the states that obesity is higher, and that obesity is associated with increased incidence of various cancers, colon cancer, for example, breast cancer, as well as cardiovascular disease is higher in these states, and neurological disorders. It's not quite as dramatic if you look at the map on the left, which is in data from 2014. But if you look at the rate of increase in neurological disorders, and these are mostly age-related neurological disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and stroke. There's been a big increase in those southern states in lockstep, uh, well, actually delayed uh, from the time that the increase in obesity increased. So as these individuals with obesity or overweight get into their 60s and 70s and 80s, they're more likely to get these neurological disorders. There's also some evidence that some mental disorders, particularly depression and anxiety disorders, uh, are associated with higher intakes of obesogenic food and obesity, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease has increased a lot. Uh, this is data going from 2010 to the present and then projected out to 2050. Um, so right now there's about 7 million people in the United States diagnosed with Alzheimer's. By 2050, that will have doubled to 14 million people. And so this is a dramatic increase. Now, part of that's because people are living longer, but also part of it's because of the poor metabolic state of the people. And sort of as a side effect of improvements in care and treatment for cardiovascular disease and myocardial infarction, so coronary bypass, for example, people who would have previously died from a heart attack when, say, they're in their 50s or 60s are now living into their 70s or 80s, and that's the danger zone for dementia and stroke as well. And there's a pretty good correlation between obesity rates and dementia prevalence on a state-by-state basis. Now, what about the environment in areas where there's high obesity? Well, there's lower physical activity. So the percent of the population with report that they know have no physical activity is very high in these southeastern states. And that's really strongly associated with obesity. So exercise is one thing, overeating, taking in a lot of calories is another. Um, Interestingly, when one looks at the brain function in students, uh, it seems to be poor on average in individuals in these states. And as I'll show you in the next slide, there's direct evidence from studies in humans that obesity can cause impaired cognitive function. But anyway, there's much lower rate of high school graduation in these states where the kids are metabolically unhealthy, and intelligence scores are also lower, overall intelligence. So there may be a transgenerational propagation of these problems, both obesity and cognitive problems, and I'll talk about that a little too. So this is a slide from a study done quite a while ago. There's quite a few more studies done looking at cognitive function, brain function, learning and memory in adults or children uh, with various levels of poor metabolic status. So normal weight, overweight, obese. And it's also been looked at in this study in relation to glucose regulation. That is something called metabolic syndrome, where you have insulin resistance and abdominal fat accumulation and often hypertension. So some of these kids with obesity have already developed hypertension by the time they're teenagers. Okay, so anyway, in this study, what they did is they looked at the correlation between glucose control, metabolic syndrome criteria, and performance on learning and memory tests. And the bottom line is, so a higher score on this test is actually poor performance. So the poor metabolic health is strongly correlated with poor learning and memory. And then they also did magnetic resonance imaging to get images of the brain structure, and they quantified the size of the hippocampus, this brain region that's critical for learning and memory. And they found that um, there was a positive correlation between glucose regulation, so good glucose regulation, and larger hippocampus. Poor glucose regulation, that is insulin resistance, smaller hippocampal size. And then they also looked at the cerebral ventricle size. Often there's a negative correlation between the size of the cerebral ventricles, where the cerebral spinal fluid is, and this amount of gray matter. So, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, there's a dramatic reduction in gray matter as neurons degenerate and die, and there's a corresponding increase in the ventricles in the center of the brain. So essentially, the the gray matter decreases in size, making room for expansion of the cerebral spinal fluid. Right. So better glucose regulation, smaller size of the ventricles, and probably overall higher size of gray matter. Okay, so we and other animals involved in environments where food was scarce and individuals had to expend both mental and physical exertion to acquire energy. And in fact, and for a lot of animals, much of their daily life is spent in activities having to do with acquiring food. Um, Brain evolution was largely driven by food scarcity. For example, in the cases of wolves, it's very likely that at some point in evolution, uh, packs of wolves that might previously individuals have kind of not cooperated with each other. When they started to cooperate with each other, they were able to capture and kill large prey that an individual couldn't by itself. So this is one example of evidence for an evolutionary pressure for development of the social brain, being cooperative with your family members and neighbors to acquire food. In human evolution, all the tools that we know of that were first invented by humans, their function of the tools was to acquire or process food, and that extended to domestication of plants and animals and farming and the ability to uh, grow and store large amounts of grains, for example, and to have meat stored in one way or another. Okay, and then this is a situation today when a lot of people are overeating, and often that's driven by profit-driven food industries that make palatable, that is, addictive tasting foods. And these foods, for example, high fructose corn syrup, promote obesity uh, and fat accumulation, and they also increase appetite or increase hunger. And even a lot of pets today are overfed. So this is the opposite of the normal system we evolved in. We didn't evolve with having highly palatable food available all the time. And so, if we put food out for animals, they may overeat and become fat, and they're relatively inactive. Okay, so this is a bad situation. I did want to point out also here that that there's really strong evidence that even the most evolved part of our human brain, the prefrontal cortex, circuits in that brain region evolved with one of the main functions is for being successful in acquiring food by making good decisions, for example, in foraging. The prefrontal cortex is very important for decision making, for what's called top-down control of impulses. And there's evidence from studies of monkeys that the prefrontal cortex is critical for making good foraging decisions, deciding where to go at what time of year to find, in this case, for example, fruits that should be ripe, and then eating the ripe fruit and deciding when to move to another area when you've consumed enough of the ripe fruit and it's not worth staying to eat the unripe fruit. Okay, so let's move on. All right, so what about the food industry, which will be the topic of this talk? We now have the vast majority of farming is large-scale monoculture crops, corn, soybeans, wheat, and nowadays pretty much all of the large-scale farming, the farmers use herbicides and pesticides, and so you'll see there's no weeds in the crops. The fields look beautiful, although I would say they actually look unhealthy in that what happens is when you have these monoculture crops, the actual plants themselves stop producing chemicals that are good for our health. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And then a lot of these grains are used, some are used to feed livestock, to fatten up cattle, for example, in these big, large scale meat production system. Some of the grain is used to produce high fructose corn syrup, which is particularly bad for health, including brain health. And we have our both the meat and the grains are processed further often to make ultra-processed food that has additives that increase their uh, tastiness and that, for example, include preservatives and modified fats, hydrogenated fats, for example. And so they're high in bad fats, low in good fats like omega-3 fatty acids. The chemical companies, and Monsanto's the one that's really been at the forefront of this. They genetically modified plants, so they changed the gene in a plant or knocked out a gene to make the plant resistant to a particular herbicide called glyphosate, or Roundup is the trade name. And so this herbicide, the glyphosate, will still kill weeds because they're not genetically modified, but it won't kill the grain crops. Okay, so that's not good. There's some evidence that the glyphosates themselves, well, there's good evidence they're accumulating in the environment and they're causing a lot of problems because they're reducing plant diversity in the field, in the areas surrounding the fields, for example, by killing non-genetically modified normal plants. So there's a reduction in biodiversity. And then lastly, these large-scale farms, monoculture farms, and using the grain to fatten up cattle and pigs and so on, generates a lot of carbon dioxide, which contributes to climate change. This is a kind of generally accepted way of classifying foods: unprocessed, Group one is unprocessed or minimally processed food. So this is essentially you go to your garden and you dig up some carrots or potatoes and maybe rinse them under water and then you put them in the microwave and eat them. That's what I do. And then, or other examples are just, harvesting grain but not further processing it, or harvesting eggs or fresh meat and not modifying it by cooking it in grease or frying it or so on. And then there's, uh, I guess, minimally processed uh, culinary ingredients that are essentially flour to make bread, not refined flour, but just regular flour, and then maybe adding some salt or something. Then processed food is adding a lot of additives to make them taste better, preserve, in some cases, preserve them. And then ultra-processed food as the foods you find a lot in the grocery store in the packages that have a long list of ingredients, a dozen or more in most cases, and these include emulsifiers, flavors, uh, stabilizers, preservatives, uh, glazing agents, gelling agents. So there's all sorts of things in there. And high fructose corn syrup is often included too. So these are addictive products. And on the right here is examples, specific examples of these. Okay, in this illustration, if you look at the center, it's overconsumption of ultra-processed foods. And this shows the consequences of this. These foods are poor in nutrients, for example, vitamins, certain amino acids, and they um, they're poor in nutrients in general. They um, they come, as I mentioned, from large-scale farming and the problems associated with that. And then these contribute strongly, and recent data is supporting this, to the development of chronic disorders, obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancers, dementia, and others. And so they're contributing then to the sickness and therefore a burden on the healthcare system, although the healthcare system is for profit. So, in a cynical view, at least, uh, increasing a burden on the healthcare system maybe not bad for these for-profit industries. Also, eating fast food, for example, tends to decrease social interactions. Families are often now not eating the same meal and cooking together, and a lot of the customs of, taking raw food and then, cooking it, maybe adding just one or two simple ingredients are decreasing. Okay, now I want to talk about fructose. There's quite a bit of evidence from animal studies and human studies that excessive fructose consumption is contributing to obesity and chronic disease, including brain disorders. And this comes, this article from a review in the Annual Review of Nutrition a few years ago, where they talk about fructose. Actually, they didn't even talk about the brain. I added that because they were actually scientists that focus on fatty liver disease and intestinal inflammation and microbiota. Uh, and so when you eat fructose, obviously, or drink it in a liquid, it enters the digestive system. And in the gut, it does a number of bad things. Over time, it decreases the number of good bacteria in the gut and increases the number of bad bacterial species. And the species, the so-called good species, produce chemicals that are thought to be beneficial for that are released into the blood and travel to various organ systems and thought to have health benefits. For example, short chain fatty acids or butyrate have been shown in animal studies anyway to have beneficial effects on the brain and may counteract disease processes in models of Alzheimer's, for example. Another adverse effect of fructose in the gut is to cause what's called leakiness. There's normally these tight junctions between the cells lining the gut, and they don't allow bacteria to move uh, from the gut into the bloodstream. But there is some evidence that high fructose levels can increase the leakiness of this intestinal barrier and cause uh, immune reaction to either bacteria or bits molecules from bacteria like lipopolysaccharide, which are found elevated in the blood when you give animals fructose in their drinking water. Okay, and then in the liver, uh, fructose is metabolized differently than glucose. It's transported into the cells through glucose transporters, but when it gets in the cells, the fructose, it can be used to generate energy, but it's also some of the, I guess, metabolites of fructose lead to accumulation of fats. And fatty liver disease is strongly associated with high fructose intake, and you can induce this in rats or mice, cause fatty liver disease. All right, so there's sort of direct ways that fructose could have adverse effects, for example, on the gut or the liver, causing dysregulation of lipid and carbohydrate metabolism and insulin resistance, or an indirect pathway where the accumulation of the fat caused by fructose then leads to inflammation and increased risk of disease. And this slide just shows a little bit of detail on uh, how fructose can lead to uh, fat deposition and insulin resistance, so diabetes. And the bottom line is uh, when it gets in the cells, it's metabolized differently, and you get decreased fatty acid oxidation, so the breakdown of fats and accumulation of fats, and also can cause uh, bad change in cholesterol profile. So decreased HDL and increased LDL and very low density lipoprotein. So that increases cardiovascular disease risk, atherosclerosis. What about the brain? There's some data from a study done by Alexis Stranahan when she was a graduate student in my laboratory. And what she did is she took rats and she divided them into two groups. One group, she put high fructose corn syrup in their drinking water, and we call that a high calorie diet. It also, the diet has high fat. And then what she did is she let the animals go for several months, and she had control group of animals that didn't have high fructose in their, didn't have fructose at all in their drinking water. And then at the end of several months, she tested their learning and memory in the water maze. And you can see here that the learning curve for the animals with high fructose intake are more shallow. They didn't learn as well how to solve this maze. So fructose impairs cognition. She also found that high fructose impaired the strength of synaptic connections uh, between neurons in the hippocampus by using stimulating and recording electrodes to look at the strength of the postsynaptic response to stimulation at high frequency of the presynaptic axons. And so you get this increase in response in the control animals, but the magnitude of the increase is significantly less in the animals on the high fructose diet. Then she also euthanized these rats and made slices of their brain, stained the neurons with Golgi stain, and in the dendrites of the neurons, she counted numbers of synapses, uh, specifically dendritic spines, which is this postsynaptic region of a synapse along the dendrites. So these spines projecting perpendicularly from the dendritic shaft are postsynaptic sites. And she found a decrease in number of synapses that's quantified here, about a 10% decrease over a period of a few months. Uh, and then in another study more recently, a group down in Chile studied, did kind of the same experiments in a species called the degu. It's a rodent. It's similar in size to rats, but they live much longer than rats, about 3 times as long as a rat, and they have some interesting value in studying aging and brain aging for that reason. And what they found is when they maintain these degus on high fructose diet, their learning and memory is impaired. They use what's called a Barnes maze, developed by Carol Barnes, a cognitive neuroscientist. And what this is, this platform here, you can see it has all these holes in it, and then they can put food in the holes, put in one hole. Then you put the animal on there, and it will kind of explore around the holes until it encounters the hole with the food in it, and it'll eat the food. And then what you do is, after it's learned where the food is, then you have a delay of time, say wait a half hour or an hour or a day, and put the animal back on the platform and see how long it takes them to go to that hole where the food was. Shorter time is an indicator that they remembered. Longer time indicates they had trouble remembering. And you can see that there's a large decrease, uh, sorry, a large increase in the time spent uh, trying to find the hole with had the food in it in the animals on high fructose. Um, they also can divide this into quadrants and ask how much time did they spend in the quadrant where food was. And the animals with high fructose spend less time there, again indicating that they weren't remembering very well where it was. They also did another test of learning and memory. It's called novel object recognition. And in this test, you have a animal in a cage, and you put two objects in the cage. They could be a small square or um, a triangle or whatever. And you have let the animals explore the two objects. Then you take the object, you take the animal out of the cage, and then you replace one of the objects with a new object, and you wait, say, a half hour. Then you put the animal back in the cage, and normally the animal will explore the new object, the unfamiliar object, for a longer time period than the old object that it had explored before. And so the bottom line is they found fructose impaired memory in this novel object recognition test. They also found, as had we, that fructose impairs synaptic strengthening in this so-called long-term potentiation model that is thought to be a synaptic correlate of learning and memory. And in this uh, paradigm, what you do is you stimulate the axons, these blue processes here, put an electrode here, stimulate these axons, and then record from the postsynaptic neuron shown in red here. And so if you stimulate at high frequency and then wait, say a half hour, and then stimulate once, the strength of the postsynaptic response will be greater than if you had not stimulated these axons at high frequency. So there's kind of a memory of the previous stimulation. Okay, and then this is from a review article by Fernando Gomez Pinilla, out California, USC. Review article on effects of fructose on the brain. So I mentioned adverse effects on the hippocampus, learning and memory, and there's some evidence for a couple ways that it's likely to occur. One is rendering the neurons insulin resistant so they can't take up uh, energy. And another is to inhibit uh, BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor signaling. So these pathway involving this transcription factor, CREB, is known to be very important for learning and memory. Also, in the hypothalamus, fructose can affect the neurons there in a way that make the individual hungrier. So they have a hunger promoting effect, and that may contribute to hyperphagia, overeating, when animals or humans start consuming fructose. Okay, so what about the developing brain, the developing baby in the uterus? Now, there's evidence from epidemiological studies that women with obesity and or type 2 diabetes, their child have poor health outcomes. They're more prone to metabolic problems, obesity, insulin resistance, than are children born to healthy weight, uh, fit mothers with good glucose regulation. Now, part of that could be the environment, family environment, that if it, on average, it's likely that a woman with obesity, pregnant woman, it's more likely her husband is overweight than not, and it's more likely her children will acquire the same diet and lifestyle habits as their parents. But there have been controls for that that suggest that there are problems going on in the developing child that lead to this. And some of that's shown here. Um, One thing, there's a couple of things about this environment that may not be good for the health of the developing baby. Uh, One is an inflammatory state. Obesity, type 2 diabetes are associated with an increase in systemic inflammation, higher levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So the developing baby, including their brain, may be subjected to somewhat inflammatory state, or indirectly, the inflammation could adversely affect the developing baby. Uh, then another thing is there's some evidence that, based on animal studies mainly, that uh, high fructose during fetal development may alter the development of the circuitry in the hypothalamus, leading to increased hunger relative to individuals born to mothers that have a healthy energy metabolism profile. What about the brain? Well, if you look, what this is an article that I wrote with a student, Aileen Ravel, for Trends in Neurosciences. And what we did here is we looked at epidemiological data on the time course of increase in obesity in the United States, childhood obesity, consumption of high fructose corn syrup, and then incidence of autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. And what you can see in this lower graph is that, as I mentioned, adult obesity took off on the uptick in the 1980s and has kept increasing. Childhood obesity followed that with a little lag. And then high consumption of fructose corn syrup also started about then, actually a little bit before the increase in obesity, adult and childhood. And then autism prevalence has increased also beginning about then and is accelerated. Part of this increase is likely to due to uh, increased diagnosis based on the behavior of the child, and the point there being that previously a child may have some autistic traits and issues, for example, problems with social engagement or engaging in repetitive behaviors or some other autistic traits. But increased recognition and diagnosis is not the only explanation, as we talk about in this article. Now, there is evidence, as I mentioned, that high fructose corn syrup is bad for the brain. And we think what's happening is as follows. So the high fructose intake during pregnancy, as I mentioned, it causes inflammatory state and increased levels of bad fats and cholesterol. And this may lead to aberrant neurogenesis and an abnormal formation of neural circuits during brain development. Um, there's actually a specific pathway that may account for this in part, and that's the mTOR pathway. The mTOR pathway, there's some genetic evidence that that pathway, which, if you'll remember from my previous talks and other Brain Ponderings podcasts, the mTOR pathway is the pathway for cell growth. When the pathway is turned on, amino acids are taken up, protein synthesis goes up, cells grow. And autophagy, the system for removing damaged and dysfunctional molecules and organelles, is suppressed. So when mTOR is up, cells are in a constant growth state and they're not clearing out junk, for example, dysfunctional mitochondria. And there is evidence that children with autism at birth, they have higher overall brain weight. So we think what's happening is the cells, the neural stem cells and the developing neurons are essentially growing too much without proper control of that growth during brain development. And this then leads to alterations in the circuit formation, probably in many brain regions, including those controlling social behaviors. And what happens at a general level, there's a shift towards hyperexcitability of neural networks. This may also be occurring in ADHD. So as you know, if you've been following the podcast, most of the neurons in the brain use the neurotransmitter glutamate. They're glutamatergic. They're excitatory. So the main circuitry throughout all the brain, doesn't matter where it is, hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, cerebellum, mostly excitatory glutamatergic neurons, 90% of the neurons. Approximately 8% of the neurons use GABA, the inhibitory neurotransmitter, and these are present in all brain regions, and their function is to constrain the activity in the excitatory neurons within proper limits that enable the neurons to carry out their functions, whether it's learning and memory or controlling body movements or social interactions or whatever. And so with constant activation of mTOR, there seems to be problems with the GABAergic neurons, impairment in the GABAergic neurons leading to hyperexcitability of the neural networks. And interestingly, environmental factors that can improve metabolic health and improve cognition, namely physical exercise, intermittent fasting, and ketones, which go up during fasting and extended exercise. They enhance the GABA inhibitory activity and thereby constrain neural network excitability within normal limits. And in fact, with aging and Alzheimer's disease, there's hyperexcitability that occurs, and it's thought now that the first neurons that become dysfunctional and degenerate are the GABAergic inhibitory neurons in Alzheimer's disease. And then you get hyperexcitability and excitotoxicity. And I've talked about all these things in my book, Sculptor and Destroyer, that focuses on glutamate. Okay, then finally, what about I talked about glyphosate and these genetically modified crops, which their use has increased dramatically since, uh, well, since the mid 90s, essentially, it started to go up. So there's tremendous use of these genetically modified plants, and glyphosate used to treat them as shown here for different crops, corn, soybeans, um, cotton, wheat, etc. And this diagram just shows how the genetic modification occurs, but essentially you do a genetic manipulation using well-established methods to disable or otherwise alter a gene in a way that confers resistance of the plant to being killed by the herbicide glyphosate. So the weeds are killed, the normal plants suck. Okay, so the monoculture crops, as I mentioned before, they're very poor in chemicals that are good for health. So in organic farming, where you don't use herbicides and pesticides, there's increased concentration of a variety of chemicals in the plants. For example, broccoli, sulforaphane is a chemical that's been studied a lot. It's well established that this chemical is high levels in broccoli sprouts, a very vulnerable region, and uh, in the developing broccoli heads. And this chemical, it's been very well shown, can stimulate cells and increase their expression of antioxidant enzymes. So this chemical actually induces a mild stress on the cells, and the cells respond by enhancing their ability to cope with uh, not only oxidative stress, but other types of stress. Another example is resveratrol, which is high concentration in the skin of grapes and some other plants. And again, these chemicals are concentrated in the regions that are most likely insects to eat. So these all these chemicals have a bitter taste. So that's one way during evolution that these chemicals have evolved so that we don't eat uh, all the plant, kill the plant essentially, or eat too much of them, or particularly eat unripe plant parts before the seeds have matured in them. We did, we helped with some studies at the National Institute on Aging, studying a chemical in tomatoes. It's called tomatidine. Now, I'm not going to show you the data. We published that. You can find it easy on PubMed if you just put in my name and tomatidine. And so this chemical, it's very high in the skin of green tomatoes. And then as the tomatoes ripen and become red, the concentration of tomatidine in the skin decreases a lot. Okay, tomatidine has a very bitter taste. And you've probably noticed that insects don't like to eat green tomatoes. Birds don't like to eat them either. And but when they get ripe, the red tomatoes, the seeds have matured. So the green tomatoes, the seeds inside are not mature. They're not able to germinate, but they are in the red tomatoes. So then Tomatidine goes down the red tomatoes. They don't taste bitter anymore. The birds, the insects consume them. The birds in particular, they can uh, poop out the seeds and distribute them. So this is a neat evolutionary way that uh, this coevolution between plants and animals can benefit both species. And also, the red tomatoes have more energy value for the birds or insects than do the green tomatoes. But these are some other chemicals. Catechins, epicatechins found in green tea, um, been shown to do good things for cells by inducing stress responses. Curcumin in turmeric root, um, and we published on this quite a while ago, more than 10 years ago, and the idea is that chemicals in fruits and vegetables that are good for our health are not themselves antioxidants. That is, they are not themselves chemicals that directly bind to and scavenge oxygen-free radicals, squelch free radicals. Instead, these phytochemicals, the reason they're in the plants is to keep insects and other organisms from eating the plants. And we co-evolved with them, though, so we can tolerate them. And in our cells, they induce stress responses. For example, upregulation of neurotrophic factors in the brain. I mentioned antioxidant enzymes, proteins that promote survival of cells, protein chaperones, actually things like heat shock proteins, which are well known to protect cells against stress. And so in the brain, then, we think that these chemicals can contribute to neuroprotection and neuroplasticity and possibly resistance to disease. The pathways for some of these have been worked out in the cells. I mentioned sulforaphane and also curcumin. They they act. There's a protein called KEAP1 that binds through these uh, sulfhydryl bonds, sulfate bonds to a transcription factor called NRF2. And sulforaphane and curcumin disrupt this interaction. And when NRF2 dissociates from KEAP1, NRF2 goes to the nucleus and activates genes that encode antioxidant enzymes and also what are called phase 2 enzymes, which are best known for their role in the liver, where they detoxify chemicals, natural chemicals like these phytochemicals here, but also drugs. And these so-called phase 2 enzymes are upregulated. So that's another interesting thing about the natural chemicals, that phytochemicals, they don't stay in our system very long because they're rapidly removed in the liver by these P450 enzymes. And that contrasts with some man-made chemicals. For example, DDT is a good example where we didn't evolve with DDT, and there aren't enzymes to get rid of it, break it down. And so it stays and accumulates in the body and cause a lot of problems. These naturally occurring toxins, if you will, stay in the system only a brief time, but it's enough time to cause beneficial stress responses in our cells. Here's some other examples with capsaicin, which is in hot peppers, and it activates certain calcium channels in the membrane of neurons called TRP channels. That calcium influx then activates the transcription factor CREB, upregulates, for example, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Another example is the epicatechins or catechins, which I mentioned. They can also activate some of these similar pathways. And this is just, I, I was invited to publish an article for Scientific American on this concept and the evidence for it of the adaptive stress response hypothesis of the beneficial effects of fruits and vegetables on health. So plants don't have the option of fleeing predators. They're stay in one place. And most plants have a lot more genes than humans do. And many of them genes encode for proteins involved in the production of these natural pesticides and other stress resistance proteins. Um, and the toxins that the plants use against these predators are consumed by us. We're omnivores. We eat plants, and they induce a mild stress reaction that's good for our cells. Not so dissimilar from the stress response seen with physical exercise or mental exercise, exercising your nerve cells, that's a stress on them, or even perhaps fasting. Anyway, so this is generally follows the idea of hormesis, where you get adaptive responses that have benefits. And yeah, this is just another article. If you're interested in this, is actually a pretty good article in this magazine on this concept. Now, there's three main ways that we prevent ourselves from opening that that prevent us from overdosing on some of these chemicals. For example, I guess maybe you could overdose on tomatidine. That's something that could be tested. But bitter taste, right? So generally, we don't like to eat a lot of something that tastes bitter. Certainly, children don't. Um, Vomiting. Too much of these chemicals in our stomach will induce vomiting, so we vomit out the chemicals. Another one I mentioned is the liver detoxification enzymes and rapid removal of these chemicals once they're in our system. And then the final one, which we've studied a lot, is adaptive cellular stress responses that seem to be good for them. Yeah, and this is just another way of looking at this from my Scientific American article, looking at it from the standpoint of neurons and synaptic connections and how some of these chemicals, caffeine, for example, is the the natural pesticide that humans consume the most. If you take tea leaves or coffee beans or even ground coffee, just the beans ground, and you put them on your kitchen table in the summer, you will not find ants eating or congregating around them. They'll avoid these caffeine-containing uh, plant materials. Uh, that's converse if you put like a piece of bread or anything with carbohydrates, particularly on it. But this chemical caffeine has a very bitter taste if you put pure caffeine on your tongue. And you can actually overdose on caffeine, although it's very rare. There are reported cases. Okay, so if you want to learn more about that, here is a list of a few articles. This is an article we wrote on some of these chemicals, including caffeine in coffee and dark chocolate, epicatechins. This article from Henriette von Prague, who was an investigator in the laboratory of neurosciences, my lab at the NIA. And before she came there, when she was at the Salk Institute, she showed that this epicatechin flavanol in dark chocolate, but it's also in green tea, um, can enhance the proliferation of blood vessels in the brain, so increase blood flow to cells, and can improve memory in a test of learning and memory in rats. And this study is another one with resveratrol, where they show and this is in postmenopausal women, they find that resveratrol can have beneficial effects on cognition and mood. Um, this one here is from a study done by Dongyu Zhou who was a former postdoc in my lab, but most of this work was actually done in South Korea. He went back there. He's a professor there. And essentially what he found is that sulforaphane reduces the accumulation of amyloid in the brain in a mouse model of Alzheimer's disease. So we have mice, these 3xTGAD mice that accumulate amyloid, shown in green here, as they age, and tau neurofibrillary tangle-like pathology in the hippocampus, shown here. However, if you give them sulforaphane, their cognitive impairment is ameliorated, so they uh, have an improvement in cognition compared to the Alzheimer's mice without sulforaphane. And that's shown here in terms of their ability to learn the Morse water maze, and it's shown here in terms of their ability to retain the memory of the maze for a period of a day or more after they've learned it. And then, even interesting, the psychedelic drugs, there's evidence now that, psilocybin, for example, which is in mushrooms, the so-called magic mushrooms, it's been shown to have beneficial effects in depression. It's pretty clear now. And there's emerging evidence. I talked with Rob Malenka about this in a podcast I did, that the psychedelic psilocybin actually is inducing kind of a disruption of neural network activity in ways that put stress on cells, nerve cells, and the cells respond adaptively, for example, by upregulating BDNF levels. So this is kind of a example of a chemical in mushrooms. Maybe it's there in the mushrooms, it has, because of its toxic properties, but in certain doses in humans, it can be beneficial. And this is all of the effective antidepressants, electroconvulsive shock, right? That's a very harsh, vigorous stimulation that upregulates brain-derived neurotrophic factor. The serotonin reuptake inhibitors do the same thing, and these psychedelics, which act on the serotonin receptors, do the same thing. So there may be a common theme there in terms of sort of what Malenka calls um, a disruptive psychiatric psychedelic cognition affecting drug. Okay, this is my last slide. Now, so I've talked about the consequences of our food industries, agriculture, ultra-processed food industries for health, including brain health. How might we counteract this? Well, the government could take major steps. There are countries where the governments have taken major steps. Singapore is a good example. I just did a Instagram live with Dan Buettner, who's studied these blue zones and published the book on the blue zones and looked at the diet of the people living in those blue zones and other lifestyle factors. And so there are some countries that, for example, we could ban high fructose corn syrup. Just ban it. Don't eat it. It's bad for our health. Why do we have it? And ultra-processed foods could be somehow monitored. The FDA doesn't really monitor these much at all. They focus on drugs a lot, and anything that's derived from a natural product. They do the preservatives and stuff they've looked at, but more work needs to be done. So then the government could also affect the agricultural industry, quit subsidizing big monoculture farms and subsidize organic, smaller farms that produce a wide variety of fruits and vegetables under conditions where they're healthier to eat. Okay, the um, research, uh, government-funded research, or even private foundations could focus more on research on risk reduction and prevention, and maybe research on how to counteract these sort of capitalistic drivers of poor health. Medical education, uh, there's no emphasis, again, as I mentioned, on prevention and risk reduction. Physicians do not prescribe and follow up on prescriptions for exercise, uh, intermittent fasting, for example, or healthy diet composition. They could. They could give a specific prescription uh, and provide referrals for resources. For example, uh, either outpatient or even inpatient resources. I would propose for people with longstanding obesity, uh, it's kind of a rehab facility since it's kind of an addictive condition that the individual would go in for a month in a nice environment with experts there that could, over a period of a month, get them on an exercise program, get them to shift their eating pattern to intermittent fasting, wean them off of high fructose corn syrup, ultra processed foods, and then even after they uh, leave that, well, I can guarantee you the people will feel better at the end of that month. And then the issue is, how to prevent relapse. So there has to be some organization between governments, uh, medical education, but family and parents are really important, educating their children and leading by example. And our education system, uh, interacts with parents. The media, uh, these drivers of poor health and disease, they function a lot through the media and kind of being disingenuous in what they're saying, or, for example, having really healthy people drinking a lot of beverages with high fructose or eating at McDonald's, or having, people with, uh, taking drugs before and after, and, showing this not representative example where they're really sick before and all of a sudden they're out acting like they're 20 years old again and perfectly healthy. So there's a big problem, and these drivers of poor health, they fund a lot of the media through advertisements, for example. So a lot of problems going on. Uh, but anyway, another way is just through education, like I'm doing now, and people spreading the word. So that's it for today about the agriculture and ultra processed food and effects on health and brain health. And next time, when I give a lecture like this, it will be on the pharmaceutical industry. In the meantime, I have a podcast next week with Jason Shepard at University of Utah, who's going to talk about a fascinating protein called ARC that is very important in the brain. And so he'll talk about his work on that, which actually started in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins and has continued as he now has his own laboratory out in Utah. Goodbye.